Access granted.
Hey folks, in today's video we will talk about and observe some of the most common applications in software which you as a QA might need in your day-to-day operations or daily work. I might go in more detail about it in the future if there is some demand for it. But we live in such times that there is a whole lot of fucking tutorials regarding almost every app and here on YouTube as well. So consider this a compilation of the essentials to get you started. You will most likely find out more details once you are on the real project. Alright, let's do this shit. First off, let's define the areas for which a QA uses the apps. And the first one is communication. So probably you're gonna need some kind of messenger for it. The next one is a system for bug tracking and team tasks tracking, the so-called BTS. The next one is project documentation, such as Confluence or Google Docs and spreadsheets for the startup seed stage companies. The next we got the test case management system, or so-called TSMC. This is basically a storage of all your test cases, of your descriptions on how the system works, and more, I mean like atomic logic descriptions, as well as other testing documentation, such as test plans, test runs, some testing reports, and others. The next we got the API testing, and here one app that stands out above all the rest is Postman. I've been using it for forever, I don't know, and yeah, it's the best tool out there for testing the API layer, specifically for such API architectures as the REST API and the GraphQL. And last but not least is coding and databases. So I use Visual Studio Code from Microsoft for writing my code and keeping my project intact and updated. So basically we're gonna see and we're gonna touch this stuff more at the practical part of this course when we get to the automation. So let's go into more details about each of these areas.
So let's start with the communication. Most projects I work on typically use Slack as an internal messenger. You can download the desktop version or use the web version of this app. Rarely it's Microsoft Teams. I've also had a project that used Skype. Does anybody even remember what's that? Jeez, we're that old if you do, my friend. I guess Slack is the most popular not because of the communication itself, because all messengers have custom channels or groups or, publics, but because of its API integrations, the ones that let you keep your hand on the pulse of basically any release, newly created task or a document, as well as join on screen when it's being shared. That last part is really cool stuff for brainstorming and planning sessions. So you're probably gonna use it on your projects as well. What amazes me though is that some projects, specifically that I have worked on, they use both Slack and Microsoft Teams like simultaneously. It's not a rare case that they also use like several messengers at once. Personally, I am against this approach because it creates entropy. If we take, the Slack by itself, the Slack app, it's got everything that your team needs. So if you wanna make a group call or a group conference, it has this function, or it has, for one-on-ones or, small calls or small chats, it's got the huddle function, which basically allows you to create, so to speak, a room or, a quick call with your colleagues. Personally, I do not really understand and I don't really get why some projects use more than one application of this kind. So personally for me it's not that convenient. If you selected one app, please stick to it, and you can maximize the output of this app, because this app allows you to use multiple functions, all these group calls, chats. If you want to record, the Slack has got this function. If you want to share screen, Slack has got this function once again. So because for example in Zoom, when you end the call or end the the meeting and you have some some links or valuable information posted in the Zoom chat, it's all gone right after you leave and end the meeting. So yeah, of course the video recording of the call of the meeting is gonna be saved, but some valuable links, if if you were not quick enough to copy them during the call, this information will be lost and you'll have to re-ask your colleagues for the same info. It is better if you maximize the functionality of a single app than trying to use multiple apps of the same kind, of the same purpose at once. So that's what I'm trying to say. So the next thing is going to be the BTS, or so-called bug tracking systems, but it's not only about the bugs or defects, it's also about, some team tasks and shit. So you're gonna need one to keep track of the defect you just created, or as well as the tasks at hand. You're gonna need to share lots of info with the team as you progress on your tasks. So that's where the bug tracking systems come in. Basically the mainstream, and it has been for many years now, is Jira, which got everything you need to exchange info and track your work progress. There's a bunch of alternatives which I've had a chance to work with, such as Trello or ClickUp. They're all good, don't get me wrong, but Jira is pretty intuitive, well, for the most part. So basically, this is how your Scrum or, Kanban board will look like. This stuff may also be called the sprint board. Basically, it consists of different columns which contain tasks. So I've created this demo project for a little showcase purpose. As an example, as a template, we got some 5 statuses right here. So the whole process, remember the SDLC process that I've been speaking about in a recent video. So basically it translates to this type of the board, which consists of several statuses, and the tasks are being moved from the status to status. So, for example, in or in development or in QA, and when it's done. But this is a simple template. Okay, so basically this is the task flow that I've implemented on one of the projects that I've been working on. There is nothing fancy, just because they didn't have a QA and they were a startup, but I think even a 5-year-old can do it nowadays. I'll just do a quick overview of this shit. Basically, when a task is created, it's in the open status, and then it's moved either to the tasks type or to the bugs type. It depends. At this stage we basically decide, when it's open, when it's still open, we basically decide, do we really need it? If it's really a bug, maybe it's just a misinformation or lack of technical expertise from the QA, so this shit happens also. It's not a big deal as many say. I've met a lot of people that were like eating their nails from the neurotic syndrome or so, because they were afraid to create a task or a bug that it's not a bug, they were afraid to make a fucking mistake. Never be afraid of making mistakes. I've learned all the shit from the mistakes I've made throughout my career. If not for the mistakes, I wouldn't be filming these videos right now. I wouldn't be filming my vision or my course of this profession. Many people are too afraid to make the mistakes, and they go through the documentation, tons of docs. They are too afraid that the lead's gonna aggro at them. Fuck that shit, We're working, if other people don't support you, don't support that you're making mistakes, and they don't see it as a way of growth, it's not your problem, it's their fucking problem. If you encounter these toxic people on a project, it's not your fault. You learn, and do not be afraid to make mistakes, or to report the tasks which are even not relevant, or bugs which are not bugs. Do not be afraid of doing so. Believe me, I was one of these guys who were too afraid of making a mistake, and yeah, it pushed me to grow. It actually pushed me to grow. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. When this is clarified, either it's a task or a bug, then this issue is being moved to the in development status. So it's been taken to a sprint, prioritized, been taken into a sprint, and the developers begin with their part of the job, basically coding this stuff. Either it's a fix or it's a new feature, doesn't matter at this point. Upon the completion of the technical part or coding part of this ticket, it's been moved to one of the lower environments. It can be called the dev environment, pre-prod, pre-staging, staging, QA, pre-QA, it doesn't matter. Every project is different in some way, so some have like one layer of the lower environments where things are being tested before they are released to production. Throughout my journey, I've met the projects or such flows which had even 4 environments. So they had like the dev, the stage, and then they had the QA, and then they had the production. All of these lower end environments are being used for different purposes. Some of them are being used mostly for tech demos or for focus groups, for the stakeholders or for the investors, for the end users, for the clients, to see how the specific feature works before it's been released. There's actually a sense behind all the shit, because when you got the lower end environment, it allows you and the client to avoid some mistakes in production, because every bug in production, if it's critical, if it's severe, it causes the money loss. So this is what we're trying to avoid. Let's proceed with this flow. So basically, if the task passes the test testing on the lower environment, it's been moved to the ready for stage deployment to another layer of the environments, or to another environment. And the logic continues in this way. If it's all positive right here, it continues up until the point when it's released in production. If at one of these stages the task doesn't pass the testing or the deployment fails, it's been moved to the clarification part. If this task either fails the testing, it's been moved to the clarification, because sometimes things that we find or we discover as QAs may be out of scope for a specific task, and that's okay as well. You don't have to know every single little detail from the developer's point of view, because maybe they have been having, some chats behind your back with the PMs or so, and it's not to fuck you up, it's just because, some requirements have changed and they just forgot to notify you. It's a common thing when the QA gets notified only when the task is in QA already. You have to be proactive in this kind of way, that you participate within the task requirements and specifications at the very beginning of the life cycle of this ticket. It's either when the testing is failed, it's been moved to the clarification, or when, for example, the requirements change right in the release process. This shit can also happen at this point when the PM comes in and says that we're gonna rewrite some logic, and then the task has to be moved because it's no longer relevant. The description of the ticket is no longer relevant at this point. So basically, this is the common tasks flow diagram that is then being moved and translated to these columns. There is also a scheme here somewhere in the, I guess, in the settings. But as a QA, I don't think that it's gonna be even worth your time, only if you're a lead or you're the only QA or the senior on the project, or you're somehow connected to the PM part of the job. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not a rare thing to switch roles or to take multiple roles at once while you're on the project. And it actually depends on the project. If it's a startup, be ready that you're gonna have more than one role at a time. So we're not speaking about big corporations or the companies which have their own processes set and strictly followed. We're speaking of a more dynamic and volatile environment. Let's switch to the documentation part. Like Romeo needs a Juliet and a can of beer needs a cigarette, Jira needs Confluence. So basically we can click this icon of application selection, and here we got the Confluence. So let's go to it. Enough said, it's the best collaborative documentation service on the market today. Well, except for the Google Docs and spreadsheets if you're just a seed startup. If you're not high on investments, then you gotta use the services which allow you to do your job. At the beginning stage, it's not always about the fancy stuff, and it's definitely not always about some comfy stuff. It's about keeping your information intact and all the valuable info, so that you can refer to it and not forget anything. Simply put it, create, share and collaborate on project docs. And you can also link Jira stuff to it. Here's the homepage for the Confluence. It consists of different spaces. There's always your personal space where you can add some documentation or test data, for example, some sensitive data which you only want to have access to. You may provide access to the specific people by sharing page, or even to specific teams or groups, or you can either share this stuff in Slack, for example. Let me just link it to the Slack. I got the test Slack created here. So this is my template project, and this is some channel, right? So here, hey, it's Confluence here. Okay, so let's switch to the Slack, just to see this stuff right here. Basically, here is this channel, and here is my Confluence link to the overview page in my personal space in Confluence. If you're a first-timer user here, you gotta accept some access. These apps are now like all interconnected nowadays, so it's one big Internet of Things shit. Right, so here you go, the same page here. Alright, that's one thing, and another thing, let's create some template document by clicking the create button. Here's my test doc. You can do all this formatting and stuff, tables and shit. Alright, so the next thing you're gonna need is some test case management system, or TCMS. So you're gonna need that shit if you wanna keep track of test cases with all the details, so that you don't forget how your app should work. You may also need it for creating other test docs, such as test plans or test runs. I'd suggest case.io. as you can see it right here on my screen. Because first of all, it's a free solution, so it's got a free version, which is not gonna bomb you with the, your trial period has ended, please pay us money and shit. So they give you the choice. Of course, there's like lots of functionality for the premium users, as it always is, but these guys started from free-for-all, so to speak, FFA project type. But even at this stage, it has everything that a QA would need, even some 3PI integration. So if we go to the apps section, for example, here it is. You can connect it with the Slack, for example, or with the Jira. Let me just select this channel. I believe you can post some stuff to the Slack if you do so. Yeah, so here's a list of the actions which will be posted to the Slack so that your team is notified when, for example, a test case is created or updated, some test run starts, or defects are created, milestones, plans, and all that shit. So basically, it lets your team to keep their hand on the pulse of the process, of the testing process. And we may also do same stuff for Jira. For example, if you're having a test run which is in progress and you found some defect and you got the Jira integration set up here, you can create a defect in Jira from the case system. This is made like purely for purposes of catching this bug or the defect as soon as possible. It looks like every other TSMC case management system out there. Let's, for example, create some test project. Right, so test project. You can set some description, and you may say it as private or public, you may invite people to it, so the security here is not an issue. When the project is created, you're presented with a test cases repository. So this is a tree-like structure, something of like a GitHub or a GitLab, which lets you create specific folders for system components and test cases within those folders. So it's a multi-layer tree-like structure. Every repository has such. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's take the ChatGPT UI, for example, right? So this is just for showcase purposes. Imagine you have to describe or to create some test designs or a quick checklist for the ChatGPT UI. So basically, yeah, what do we have here? We have the left side menu and the chat area itself. How would I do that if I had to describe the shit? I would create a suite and call it ChatGPT here. So this is a project root, and within this suite I can also create another suite. So let's create two components here. Left side menu and of course messaging area, sorry. And then you can create subcomponents and cases. So yeah, let's just create a quick case which would go something like this. So when we click the new chat button, it opens the new chat. Create quick test. So it gives us some hints. Open new chat. So here is this case. If I go to this test case details, click on the edit, here we have lots of shit right here. So basically, yeah, it's all the statuses, the descriptions. You can change the components. Here you got the priority, you know, some technical severity. You got the layers here. I'm gonna tell you about the test environment in a separate video. For the time-saving purposes and throughout all of my projects, mainly startups, 80% of the shit was not used. So basically, all we had to do is create this tree-like structure that I've shown you, drop a few checklist type test cases. You got the steps, you got the conditions, the preconditions or post-conditions, such as test data, you know, some specific credential, user credentials, for example, or specific URLs for the specific environment. Test case steps. So yeah, you can either it's a step or a shared step. First step would be open ChatGPT, of course. Then the next step is click the new chat button. And the expected result here is gonna be that new chat window is displayed, or so to speak. New chat window is displayed. Okay, we click save and this test case is done. In the quick view, you can see it here. You gotta describe the functionality you're testing in the most convenient way for you. So keep in mind that everything you do within the test documentation or the test repository or whatever the hell it is, you're making it for yourself. That next time you do some regression testing or some UAT or smoke, doesn't matter. You gotta do it for yourself at first so that you understand, you and your colleagues, but it has to be understandable for you. If you're new to the team and they do this stuff in some specific way, okay, let them show you so that you understand, because historically they are doing this shit their own way. By the way, this is an example of how the case integration works with the Slack application. So you can see the projects that have been created and all the suites and the test cases as well. So you can modify all this stuff to suit your needs and your team needs, of course. If you're not done with this service, of course, you can go with more established services like TestRail or something embedded in Jira like X-Ray or Zephyr. Let's switch to the API testing software now. So when it comes to testing data exchange under the hood, like manually, personally I can't find a better app than Postman that would fit in. So you wanna get the quickest API explanation in the entire universe? Well, here we go. So API is like two people communicating with each other. Imagine that a person walks into a bar and asks the bartender, I want to order a beer. What beers do you have? What can you offer me? What's in the menu? And the bartender starts to list all the beers which they have in the menu. So I've specifically found the API which is called the Punk API, which is pretty funny, which is like an abstract description of what I've just said. To replicate this behavior from the machine interaction perspective, let's create a collection in Postman and let's add a new request to this collection. Right, so let's call it like get beers. And let's put the URL right here. So what can we see on the screen in general? If you're new to the API in general, right, so if you haven't heard this term before, it's an abstract description of what's going on in the real world. And APIs are basically requests and responses, so that is all there is. And we have just created a request which has the following parameters. So this one is pretty important to understand. So any request can have different types. Yeah, so like first off, we're speaking of the REST API architecture. So we're not speaking of some advanced shit like GraphQL and so on. Any request has its own type. So what I mean by that, we either query the data from the server, some specific data. The server returns some information onto our device, or so to speak onto the client. Such methods have the get type. If we are sending or creating some data entry on the server from our client, from this device. So if we, for example, were about to add a new beer, we would send a post request. Same goes for put, same goes for patch. But there is a key difference between post, put, and patch. And this is a tricky interview question, by the way. When you post a request, you create a new entry on the server side. So, for example, you add some new beer lager that wasn't there before. If you send a put request, you replace an already existing resource. So for example, you've been selling some dark lager or ale and it's out of stock and there's no demand for it, but there is a demand for a new ale. So this new ale, you send the information about it and it replaces like the old entry. For example, it had an ID of some kind, a specific unique ID, and this new ale is gonna have the same ID. So you're gonna send this info and replace the old one with a new one. So that's put, basically. And if you're sending a patch request, then it means that you are updating some information about the specific resource. Imagine that you have 10 liters of dark ale remaining in your warehouse, or in stock, so to speak. And you have just had a delivery of another 50 liters for your trading purposes. In the physical world, the guy's just gonna unload your goods and deliver them strictly to your store or wherever you're selling from. From the IT and this abstract, the cyber, so to speak, point of view, it's gonna go like this. So you're gonna have to send a request, the patch request, which is gonna contain info about the exact amount of the specific beer, and it's gonna be updated at the database so that in your application or your storage application or whatever you're using, or your website for your customers to order this stuff, the info is gonna be updated there. So they can see like the most recent, the most fresh version of the data of the goods in stock in your store. And then there is a delete type of the request. So if you're out of stock for some goods, or you're not gonna be selling, for example, a dark lager in the future, so it's out of stock and you see that there's no demand for it, you just have to delete it from your stocks and from your database. I think you get this point. All these options here, this one's not important. I have never encountered this stuff in my throughout my career. So you have to understand these 5 request types. types. This is gonna be more than enough for you to use and operate with the REST API architecture. Yeah, but let's get back to the GET endpoint. So the next part is the URL. So this is a specific address, like the domain and the tail, so to speak, or the slug it's also called. Each request is unique in some point. So to show this uniqueness, you need the URL, the endpoint itself. So that's how it works in the REST API. And yeah, this is the version of the API. This is the request we're querying. So yeah, look, we have been querying the beers in stock. The next thing, we also have some headers in our request. So what do these headers mean? They are basically some small chunks of data, such as user agent. I'm sending this request via the Postman web application, so it shows me the Postman. If I were to send another request strictly from my web browser, web client, this is how it would look like. So I gotta go to Chrome DevTools. I'm using the Chrome browser. We got some requests in the network section. Here's the user agent. Basically, this is the same as here, and it grabs the data. Remember, I was speaking about the data that everything you do is on the internet, or almost everything is either way tracked. So this is one of those things to prove me right. This header collects information about your browser engine, your operating system, and your device. So as you can see, it's the Macintosh, Intel Mac, and the OS X version. There's like tons and tons of such data stored with these headers, which is being sent from your client to the server. There's also an authorization header, but for the sake of this demonstration, I've decided to take something simple just to show you how it actually works. And then there is such part as the response, and response has the status code. You may find some commonly used status codes throughout the internet. It's not a difficult thing to search for. There's basically 5 groups of those. Each code represents something from the real world, so to speak. So if it's 200, it's okay. As you can see in the response body, the data has been returned successfully. So yeah, and there's like lots of beers and information about the beers right here. But let's say I type some incorrect URL here. It's gonna return the 404 because it does not have such query. So we are querying something that does not exist, like in the real world. It's like asking for a wine when you're in a beer shop. Of course, this also can return 500, but this would mean that the website or the server is not working. So I guess you get this point. So this is basically an overview of the APIs. We may get into more details later, but I think I've provided enough info for now. Alright, so the next thing is the database. It's really difficult to find some OpenDBs that you can connect to via some desktop clients, so for the sake of this demo, I've decided just to do a little showcase of an open source SQL editor, and yeah, the online compiler, as it says. The DB layer is the lowest in the pyramid. It basically represents the raw data. The data can have multiple types of it. Can be just raw text, simple text, it can be of a JSON types, but we're not gonna dig into that. From my perspective, SQL is the best because it's the oldest and it's most reliable. It's most understandable. There's gonna be a lot of people who can argue with that, and I've used non-SQL DBs as well. It's easier to automate some hybrid test cases which require you to query the DB to check whether some data entry was or was not created or was, changed in some way. So this is why we go with SQL, and its syntax is pretty clear and it's all over the internet, or you can just type some stuff into the ChatGPT and it's gonna create a query for you if you're a lazy ass like me, or if you're just simply new to the topic and you're not familiar with the syntax. Let's see how ChatGPT works, by the way. So raw data is stored in tables which have parameters and indexes, or the IDs of the data entry. So here we got the customer IDs, these are the numbers, and we got first name, last name, age, and country. So let's ask ChatGPT to print, the query which will return customers whose first name is John and whose age is above 20 years. How would I construct this question to the... I've got an SQL table with such params, and here are these parameters. The task is give me the query, and the data is also, the data is as the following. So the task is like, give me the query which will return all customers named John and whose age is above 20 years. Okay, so as you can see, here is the SQL query. So it selects all the entries from this table where the first name equals John and age is more than 20 years. So let's just copy this shit to our SQL editor. So the table is, I guess it's called customers, right? So this is the customers table. And let's run the SQL. Alright, so as you can see, here's the output. So we got our two customers named John. If we look at the age column, so it's gonna show that both their age is more than 20, obviously. If we were to change it like to 25, more than 25, it should return only one John. Yeah, so we got only one John here with the age of 31, which is obviously like more than 25. So here's how this shit works, basically. And last but not least is the coding part. So most of my time, like all times, I use the VS Code IDE, which is the code editor, and I got the projects right here. And basically, if I open the project, it goes to the Explorer where I got all of my files in the test suites, the automation. As I've mentioned in the very beginning of the series, the automation is gonna be demonstrated as a separate video where we're gonna go through a website for practicing automation, and we already got the test cases for that, so we're just gonna set up our testing suite with the Playwright framework, just automate stuff. For the sake of this demo, I'd like to introduce you to one of the free online cloud-based code editors such as Playcode.io. I've already created the Typescript template here. So as an automation, sometimes we need some specific test data. Let's say every time we log into the system, before we log in, we generate a new test user. So we're gonna need some specific email, and I don't see a better way than just ask the ChatGPT to create a code that will generate the email every time. Let's try and do that. So you gotta formulate your query to the ChatGPT. What do you actually need? I'm using the Typescript. I need a function which returns a random email string in the following format. So let's give it a format. That'd be something like and it's gonna be some numbers here, and it's gonna be like a test and like this. Alright, so here is the code. Let's try and use it here. Yep, works pretty good to me. Let's go through this code. It describes some function named generate random email, which is gonna return us a string. We define the characters. So here's like the list of characters which are being used in the end result. And then we got this, which is gonna return a specific length of the string. So what I mean by length is the amount of symbols which go before the email domain part. In our case, it's before the test.com part. So the maximum length of this shit is gonna be like no longer than 15 symbols. And here's what it does basically. I can assure you that you're not gonna touch this code for a while, so you can just paste it into your test suite, and if you need another specific email format, you can just go to the ChatGPT, give it more details, for example. If I wanna, for example, modify it in a way so that it gives me only letters in the beginning and, numbers in the end, let's try modify our query. So modify the code so that it returns an email in such 10 letters. Alright, first 6 numbers, after let's specify letters, and here numbers only. Yeah, so as you can see, it's gonna now it's got 2 cycles, and it's gonna generate the letters part. It's not gonna be more than length of 10 symbols, and the numbers is not more than 6 symbols. So let's try that out. Yep, and as you can see in the console, it basically returns us the characters at first, I mean the letters and only letters, and then it's got the numbers here. So if I switch to the old code, it's gonna return letters and numbers mixed. But here, the first 10 are letters and the last 6 are numbers. See? So yeah, basically that's how you can use this, the AI to, to help you in your coding process. If you don't want to, fry your brain like thinking all these little details by yourself. So yeah, it's a great tool. So don't look at it as some vigilante that's gonna take over the world, it's gonna kill your profession. No, it's just a helper, it's just a tool. It all depends on how detailed your query to this instrument is.
Alright, digital warrior, you're all geared up and ready for battle. May the gods of cyberspace shine 101 upon your lazy ass. Peace!
Access denied.